Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity for EIB to basically talk. It's always a curse if you are the first one, because it's very likely that the audience is not fully there. So the curse actually happened, and we are missing a bit of the audience. And I just hope that they will catch up somehow. Likewise, as to the expectation, I need to tone this down a little bit. I mean, EIB is not there to tell you actually how to do these things. We can just give you a feedback of our experience. We can give you an idea of how EIB has dealt with that in the past and how we actually position ourselves within the complexity of infrastructure procurement. As you might know, EIB is the bank that belongs to the still 28, soon 27 member states of the European Union. And we have a role to play. And this role to play is we are banking for our member states. But we are operating in a commercial environment. And EIB has been created in 1958 primarily to support infrastructure investments. When we were created, our biggest office was Rome, and actually most of the investments that EIB fostered went into the destroyed infrastructure still from the Second World War to actually build up the southern Italy and then actually growing. We were growing in terms of mandates, in terms of missions, in terms of sectors that we could intervene, and actually we became the biggest multilateral bank in the world, and infrastructure was and is still one of our prime focuses. So we have seen over these more than 60 years the value of infrastructure. We have seen also changes in the world of infrastructure and changes in the world of financing. And I think they are, if you compare the 60s or late 50s to today's world, it's a tremendous change that actually came across. The deepening of the European Union, the arrival of unified capital markets, the arrival of the euro, the development of procurement technologies actually proved to be just revolutionary. Even though the context of PPP, I mean, one always needs to recall, I mean, it's a very old concept, which actually is more than 400 years old and was developed by, well, depending on who you talk to, but the French actually claim that they did it first. And interestingly, for things like canals and things where you would not basically think of two PPPs or in that sense, but actually it was. And they also had it also for prisons. And they had it for roads, so the turnpikes basically are the prime examples for this type of procurement. Now, the infrastructure sphere, from when EIB actually came to the scene, was largely dominated by public procurement. So the big loans, even when I came to the bank a long time ago, I won't tell you how long because that's a bit embarrassing, we still did the big loans with the Caisse Nationale des Autoroutes, with the big players in Italy, the big players in Germany. So there was not really a scope to really investigate how this could be optimized. But very soon afterwards, we saw developments coming through the UK, through Portugal, development of the French systems, the development of the German A models. And of course, then we had this type of procurement expanding in different sectors. So we first saw it in the roads, then we saw it in airports, then we saw it in hospitals, social infrastructure. And actually now we see it quasi for everything in a lot of various shapes and forms. Now, what we are talking about is, it's not a financing technology or technique, it's a procurement methodology. So the value of good procurement is, as it is for public procurement, it must be efficient. So it must produce value to the public side and value to the end users, which actually are the people who use these infrastructures or benefit from it. And the value is actually to have a functioning infrastructure. Now, if we move to PPPs and why you should do this and what can go wrong, I mean, of course, we have a lot of examples. And of course, we are moving on very thin ice if we want to say one is better than the other, or PPP is the thing that everybody needs. Actually, it's not. And quite interestingly, we have been hard pressed by our management committee internally to basically come up with something to say that yes, EIB is supporting PPPs, and PPPs are very good and should be promoted. But it's hard to do so because it has value, and I'm coming to this in a second, but it's hard to compare. Public procurement usually flies under the radar when it comes to success or non-success, except a couple of exceptions, like famous capital airport in Germany, hospitals in Austria. I mean, this type of things, I mean, where it comes to the public mind that actually public procurement can go wrong and can go badly wrong. Likewise, it's very difficult to find data to actually compare the outturn cost of public procurement with a PPP. And PPPs are complex. PPPs are complex to explain. You have a life cycle approach to it, to these projects, and the life cycle approach includes that these costs are actually made visible. So you have life cycle costs being visible. So if you do an availability-based road, you actually see what it will cost from inception until the last end of this concession. And you need to budget these costs. Whereas with public procurement, you don't need to do that. You basically build it. You can build it in lots. You can build it in smaller pieces. You can build it according to availability of budget, which is something which is pretty convenient for politicians, because infrastructure is something that is not very political, in a sense that the one who's taking a decision to launch a PPP from the politicians will most likely not be the one who is cutting the ribbon. And that is due to the life cycle of infrastructure, the planning cycles, the increasing complexities also in terms of environmental protection, and so on and so on. And it's, of course, due to then the execution of it. I mean, building a road or a bigger piece of infrastructure takes years. So it takes some strategic vision to go out there, say that you want to have a piece of infrastructure, commit budget for it, and commit capacities to actually do that. These capacities, they start to be very, very complex. So for a public side to successfully procure infrastructure in a model where you have private capital going in there, private competence going in there, in a manner to leverage on the capacity of the private sector to optimize investments, you need to be good at procurement. So you need to organize competition in a way that the capacities of the private sector is actually benefiting the public sector. That's where the difficult piece starts. And that's where EIB is also sitting there, because we are very often called upon by public sectors, entities who want to do procurement with PPPs, infrastructures, in all sorts of sectors, and say, how should we do? We basically say, well, first of all, organize yourself, because you need to have clear competences and you need to have a skill set within the public sector to successfully procure things. That is quite difficult, because attracting the type of people who is able to conceptualize a whole life cycle infrastructure, including the legal, technical, financial aspects of it, is not necessarily the ones that you always, by default, find in public administrations. So you need to create acceptance for this type of skill set, and you need to somehow protect it, and somehow put it in an organizational framework where it can deliver what it is asked to deliver, a complex piece of documentation that is actually leading to the implementation of infrastructure. Another thing is transparency. PPPs are very difficult to defend in a pub talk. So whenever you are in a bar and try to defend that, it boils down to something where people ask you, isn't that actually selling the crown jewels of the country? Isn't it actually privatizing the benefits and actually socializing all the negative aspects of it? Isn't it giving an undue profitability to private partners? And isn't this ultimately much too expensive? So it's difficult to argue with that, because the numbers, if you compare them, especially when it comes to things like public sector comparators or things like that, yes, the publicly estimated figures for public procurement, they are much smaller than the life cycle cost for PPP. That's a fact. And yes, you have legal complexities, and yes, you have lawyers that work for you day and night that cost a lot of money, and then you have all the banks, and indeed, the financing rates for PPPs are higher than most of the financing rates of a public entity who would borrow money to do the same thing. And that is in particular true when you come to an interest rate environment where you have negative interest rates for public states. And that is really a difficult case to argue in. But what you want is effective implementation of infrastructure. So the argumentation afterwards is to say, how can you do that? And actually, if you compare the rare data sets that are available or that EIB has access to, let's say through our own portfolio, then you see that a lot of PPPs are done on time and on budget. And the mechanics seem to work in some cases, not in all cases of all. You have the, let's say, showcase failures, but you also have the success stories that nobody talks about. You have about, I think, 11 roads now being financed and built in Germany with ticket sizes, so investment sizes between 150 and 1.3 billion euros actually each. So if you look at these, yes, they are highly publicized each and every time something goes wrong, but if you look at the sheer numbers for the public sector, they actually add up. You have a very efficient and functioning market, of course in the UK, of course in the Netherlands, for instance, where nobody even talks about the mode of procurement anymore. It's not put forward that this is a PPP, it is one way of procuring it, and it works. It's more or less cookie-cutter business. This is very often due to experienced players from the public side, but also experienced players from the private side. And of course, an availability of financing. So, if you look at what can go wrong, I mean, crazy, everything can go wrong. So, discipline in all sorts of cases is extremely important. So you have a legal due diligence carried out, your technical, environmental due diligence carried out, compliance with EU rules carried out, and actually choose the partners that are responding to your set of values that you want to see covered by your procurement. And that needs to be organized. And it is not easy for procuring authorities to actually do this on their own, especially if they decide to do it for, let's say, reasons of budgetary efficiency. Because let's face it, the on-balance, off-balance sheet discussion of infrastructure is there, and it is a driver for a lot of governments. We have seen states say, we do this infrastructure if it is off-balance sheet. Well, that's the starting point, which is difficult because rules change, and we have seen this recently, and the EC is, the European Union is not static, and the rules of Eurostat also evolve, so one needs to live with that, and needs to think from the outset, isn't it better to actually think about efficiency more than on or off-balance sheet treatment? Now, you can target off-balance sheet treatment, but you need to be clear what this means afterwards in terms of risk transfers and in terms of your ability to steer the private partner. And the private partner will actually face a different set of challenges if the more risk it takes on board, the more it will face challenges to actually get the financing together. But these are things to be sorted out in the beginning. And I think, again, transparency is one of the key words here. So to be open in your communication if you want to tender this type of things, what you want to achieve and how you want to achieve it. It means, I mean, you need to attract a certain skill set to these projects, and this is going across industries. Because a PPP will not happen if you don't have a functioning legal would not say infrastructure, but legal service industry, which is behind, financing industry, and of course the construction industry. Transparency is also important to manage expectations with political sides, so the political decision makers. They need to take decisions knowing what they're doing and properly communicate these. And of course, and I think this is most important, is to align the interests of political decision makers, technical decision makers, but also the public, the wider public. The wider public is, in these debates, as alluded to before, difficult to actually steer when it comes to, how to say it diplomatically, like media, which is, let's say, short-sighted, that is does not have a tendency to go into the technical details of PPPs, but basically goes for a more emotional debate about why this should be done or should not be done. EIB has a role to play here. And the role is, of course, that we are interlocutors and partners for procuring authorities. We also understand that the smaller the economy is, the more the procuring authorities will come up with a very little number of deals. So if Slovakia is doing a big road infrastructure, it is not necessarily a one-off, but it is a big challenge for the administration to get themselves organized to do things. And of course you have various echoes, various information flows of the industry who try to influence that. EIB is a partner on both sides. So we advise public sides, we discuss with public sides about discipline, about how to go actually really leveraging competence into these transactions, how to organize competition. We have our views on that. And on the other hand, we accompany the bidders afterwards. So the private side needs to also have a reliable partner when it comes to funding. We have put together what we call the European PPP Expertise Center, which is like a forum for public procuring authorities to come together, exchange on experiences, put together guide to guidances, put together case studies where we have internationally renowned experts who are working for us, who try to actually document what can happen. I can only invite you to have a look at their website. It's EPAC. It is actually linked to the EIB's website. You can easily find the link to it. And it showcases how important it is for smaller public sites to be part of something bigger. Because let's face it, if you're sitting in a small country, the people you will be likely to deal with are internationally renowned, big global players. May this be on the financing side or the constructor side. I mean, these people, it is, and in the audience there are people from the industry, it is their life and business. They do this all the time through all countries. They know how to play with these. They know how to position themselves. They know how to voice their interests and actually bring through some of their points when it comes to contractual negotiations and so on and so on. So it is something where we believe it is important to come together and actually give this sense of union and European union also to procuring authorities and help them to actually confidently go forward and have somebody to turn to and actually ask, is this okay or if it's not okay? On the private side, of course, we also try to be part of a funding discipline. Because when we come to funding and funding trends, of course, the funding of a PPP, the financial close, is the end point of the procurement process. And when it comes to this end point, everything must come together. And we all know that the process can be horribly long. Between conception of a transaction and actual financial close, I mean, what we see is between 4 and, let's say, 10 to 15 years. So if you run these processes, you better be focused, you better have a long-term vision, and you better make sure that the institutional setup that you choose to go for it is there to stay. Because that is important for investor confidence, also for confidence of people who want to build these infrastructures, and of course for people who want to finance them. Let's not forget, I mean, it is still business. and business has interests, and these interests must be served somehow. So long-term vision, focus, transparency, and efficiency, and competition, clear and open competition, I think is really the key here. When it comes to discipline and funding, which is the main part of what we do, EIB is ready to accompany transactions, but we all change. We have a portfolio of about 250 project finance transactions, and it is not that big. It's about 20 billion actually that we have outstanding, but we are a long-term player. We don't sell down our debt, and we are there to sort things out if things should go wrong. But it comes with a price. The price is not the financial price, because we actually are still one of the cheapest players in the market. And I think it's important that we provide financial benefit to the investors who do these infrastructures, because by keeping the cost low, intrinsically we support the sustainability of infrastructure investments. We facilitate also decision-making, because we will be there, because we will have seen the project and analyzed the project in the very beginning with the public side, and in the end, we go through all detailed due diligence with the private side before financial close. The price is rather that we are pretty conservative when it comes to structuring, because one of the points that we see is there is no worse thing than a failed infrastructure or a deal which goes belly up at one point in time, because that hits the public minds. And the debates that this is triggering afterwards is very, very difficult to get back in the box. Discipline is important. So for those who basically know the field, I mean, we talk about equity participation, we talk about cover ratios, we talk about tails, we talk about maturities, and so on and so on. We follow this market, and we try to be also as a product competitive. And EIB moved from being basically a very risk-averse institution, from only doing sovereign loans, to then going into the project finance area with bank guarantees. We moved on into being pari passu lenders with others. Then we moved on to basically giving ourselves guarantees, taking subordinated position, developing products together with the EU that cover specific risks and carve them out of project structures. Like we did a traffic risk guarantee at one point in time. We did subordinated tranches that would allow PPP transactions to go directly to capital markets, what we call the Project Bond Initiative. So we are pretty much a risk-taking institution right now, and this even became more acute when we did the European Fund for Strategic Investments back now 6 years, the so-called Juncker Plan, where the institution was tuned into really risk-taking, into a risk-taking institution. It changed the culture of the bank. It enhanced our abilities to take risks on our balance sheet and to actually go deeper down the road of helping infrastructure coming out the ground. Now, the world changed also a bit in terms of liquidity. And the over-liquidity that we see right now in the market is hampering the ability for public and private sides to actually impose discipline. Because you will have people who do whatever to actually get a decent return. And this is especially true in the current interest rate environment. I mean, to my opinion, it is not normal that you have 30 years infrastructures exposed to full project risks, getting away with a coupon of 50 basis points. So, right, people could basically park their money at central banks and pay for it. Instead, they could also go for this type of investments. But you need to acknowledge that the likelihood that something goes wrong, I mean, is there. You lose one transaction out of a portfolio of 100 in this type of environment, and it's pretty close to a wipeout of all the portfolio. So, in absolute terms, yes, we have an eroding funding discipline, but we also have, and this is a very recent development, a reluctance of investors to take long-term positions for this type of relatively low returns. So it's a bit of a contradictory world. And sometimes you see deals completely oversubscribed. Sometimes you see actually committed bids being pulled back because people in investment committees say, hang on, this is actually not normal. So honestly, would I know where this goes? I don't know. I know that EIB is sometimes considered as being like crucial by our co-financiers to actually get the financing together. Sometimes people say, what are you doing there? Because we could have done it on our own. As a matter of fact, I think the strategic routing of the bank in the whole process is something that is deeply helping infrastructure come forward. We don't need to finance everything. We also try to really position ourselves as a crowding in bank to actually to make space for everybody to come in that. But we need to have this role of helping the public side and disciplining the financing. This is key for us, because otherwise, I mean, we have no position to leverage our European policy goals into this type of projects. When it comes to the title of the conference, infrastructure and environment, let's take a view which is maybe a bit odd, but if you look at where financing streams go, I'm not talking about the infrastructure itself. I mean, infrastructure itself, maybe I come to it in 1 second, of course needs to be in conformity with European environmental legislations. But if you look at financing and to what happened in the last year in terms of, like, let's say, the green focus, what you see is an increasing pressure for investors, for institutional money, to go green. So the CO2 debate, the environmental debate, will actually boil also down into where are the financing streams going. Let's also face it, that there are big pieces of infrastructure that are not necessarily green. Not necessarily green. They are, of course, important, and they are, of course, crucial for the functioning of our economies. And Europe has still, in a lot of areas, a lot to do to catch up, to basically put in place functioning infrastructures, transport sector, social sectors, whatever you want. But what you increasingly see is that financing starts to go green. So it's increasingly difficult to find financings for coal, gas, and actually CO2-intensive industries. This will also come to EIB, because our shareholders are also pushing for decarbonization of our lending, which is absolutely understandable, because I think that the consequences of how we deal with our environment is now becoming obvious, and I think that the public pressure which is building on political decision makers is not unreasonable. It's something which is potentially going in the right direction. But it will make a difference of where the money goes and how it goes. I mean, you see in the market, in the corporate world, you see increasingly green financing. So you have green indexations where you have interest rates that are actually linked to the CO2 reduction performances of companies. And you have, of course, like an even more acute over-liquidity when it comes to renewable energy assets like wind, photovoltaic, this type of things. So will this make infrastructure financings more difficult? Maybe. So one of the maybe final points that I would raise in this context is, if you procure infrastructure today, and which is likely to come to the market at one point in time, make sure that you cover these aspects, that you actually look through the environmental impact of the investments. There's a lot to be done, I mean, which is not obvious. Even for a road, I mean, cases can be done and argued that actually if you reduce congestion, you reduce CO2 consumption. These argumentations should be developed very early on in the process and should be fine-tuned and according to the information available. So that is something which will most certainly help your project if and when it hits the market. If the current focus, and which I fully expect and hope actually that it will stay, on the environment will be there. Likewise, the definition also of the project, think about enlarging it, like charging infrastructures, or think about adding components that might reduce the negative input, the negative impact that transport infrastructure in particular can have. Think about carbon neutrality. Think about, let's say, near-zero energy buildings. Things like that and aspects like that should be integrated and be part of successful infrastructure procurement. That was basically my last argument for that one. I thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a very interesting day. Thank you very much.
We have room for a question as well. So if you, yeah, so we have already, I saw from Slido, there is a question for you. So let's have a one or two.
Yeah.
So can we open the Slido, please? So the question is, Matthias, considering that most of the infrastructure development in the Baltics is small side, does or can the PPP model be effective?
I mean, what we have seen, what we look at, are potentially rather the bigger ones. And it's true that if you have a unit, there's a cost. There's a block of costs which is potentially difficult to reduce. So the smaller the infrastructure is, the more difficult it will be to actually justify the legal costs, the transaction costs, the time you spend to actually do these. But I think that if it is intelligently done, and if you put the process right, you can procure successfully infrastructures in the region of 25 million on or around. This is what we have seen in some countries, like Austria is a good example for the smaller road pieces, for schools, for instance, social infrastructure, where if they put it right and they have like a correct deal flow and you can actually showcase that it's worth the investment, it's not a one-off, then I think that this type of ticket size is okay. If it is a one-off, just one, and you need to basically build the whole skill set just for this one transaction, it's true that it's probably difficult to justify.
Okay, and I have one question as well. Considering that, let's take Germany, like long history of doing very kind of different financing deals, the manufacturing, everything has been there for a long time, whereas in here 30 years ago, nobody's allowed to do financing deals. They went to prison during the Soviet times. So what would you say is the biggest difference in the Baltic markets comparing to these mature markets in terms of complicated structures like PPP? So what is the kind of biggest difference or biggest challenge for us?
Quite frankly, I mean, I wouldn't consider Germany to be like the super developed market for that one. They were latecomers to the scene, and when they developed it, what they did nicely was that they had like an industry roundtable where they tried to get financiers, legal, construction companies, like all the usual suspects to actually do that, to get around the table and try to actually have a strategic vision. That was the basis of the first deals to actually happen. So. It's a question of where do you position yourself in this timeline. I don't see any hindrance whatsoever to actually, for the Baltics, to access this type of financings, to make it a cookie-cutter business, and to basically learn from what the others did wrong. I mean, the Germans, for the roads, they choose to have very, very complicated remuneration schemes based on traffic axles, load factors, pollution categories, and so on and so on, which led to dramatic difficulties in projecting actually revenues. So once they fixed that, they went on to a much easier mode of remuneration, and now it is easier for them to do this. So you don't need to take these detours; you can directly go to the end point, and that is an advantage for the latecomer.
Thank you. That was very interesting insight. Thank you.